Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos and I've finally realised that I really hate dance as a part of musical theatre. So, if I saw Sir Lancelot dance a lot in Camelot, I'd damn a lot. Well, this is the first episode of Musical Talk after the 2022 Edinburgh Festival Fringe has come to an end. And the most exciting thing I can say is that we had an Edinburgh Festival Fringe at all this year. It was a jubilant return to normality. And for those of us who went, it was a wonderful experience, as it always has been in the past. And it's somehow fitting that the best celebration that we can have for this being the 75th anniversary of the Edinburgh Festival Fringe is for it to have returned in such an impressive and wonderful way. And while statistics don't in themselves mean very much, they do sometimes tell us something at a basic level, because it's estimated that over 2.2 million tickets were sold, of which there were 3,334 shows. One might argue one too many, just because of the statistic there, but only if you're the kind of person who likes to see patterns. Somehow 3333 shows seems slightly better than 3334. I wonder which was the extra. And there were artists coming from an estimated 63 countries from across the world, including Canada, Finland, Belgium, Taiwan, South Korea, Denmark and Australia. And there were many more. And there were over 3,000 performances by street performers, which is a very different part of the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, but certainly helps to make up the atmosphere as you're walking around Edinburgh, that fine, fine city. So whilst numbers and ticket sales were slightly down on previous years, it's certainly true to say that they weren't down in any way that will make a visitor to Edinburgh and the Festival Fringe think that the festival was anything other than back and back in earnest. And of course, for Musical Talk, that's a wonderful thing. The Edinburgh Festival Fringe is the biggest arts festival in the world, and long may it continue to be so. And whilst the popular press may portray it as a festival for comics and comedians, the reality is it's a much bigger thing than that. It is about the arts in pretty much all of its forms, but certainly the performing arts can be found in the Edinburgh Festival Fringe without even having to look for them. If you're interested in dance, and by the way, what I said at the beginning of the programme isn't true, that was just a cheap joke, then dance is very easily found. If you like drama, straight drama as it's sometimes called, you can absolutely find that. And of course, if you're a fan of musical theatre, then musical theatre is available in spades, by the bucketful, by the armful, by the cartload. There is, in short, an abundance of musical theatre at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, and whilst that continues to be the case, Musical Talk intends to continue to visit. And so in this week's episode, we're going to continue our roundup of the highlights of the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. What you're going to hear this week is very similar to what you heard in the last episode, 10-minute segments of some of the interviews that I conducted when I was there, to give you a flavour of some of the offerings that were available to the lover of musical theatre. And this week, we're concentrating on 5 shows, all of which, in their different way, are classic pieces of musical theatre or adaptations of long-established classic drama. And one of the many wonderful things that I find when I'm interviewing people about shows, whether at the Fringe or otherwise, is the interesting way that conversations develop. They move around, they're serpentine, you go off on tangents, and you always find something new or interesting that sheds light on the piece of work that you're reviewing or talking about. And as you'll hear in the 5 conversations today, that's exactly what happened in each of the discussions I had about the 5 shows we're talking about today. So, let's get the ball rolling, and we'll do so with a show which is already a fully established classic, and that's Stephen Sondheim's Company. Now, of course, this is the first Edinburgh Festival Fringe which has taken place since the passing of Stephen Sondheim, and there was a chance to see some of his works at the Fringe. The one I went to see was his 1970 classic show, Company. But although it was written in 1970, of course, it's a show that's continued to develop over the years. And most recently, of course, there has been a version where Bobby, Robert, has become Bobby Roberta. The central character has become female, and you could have seen that in London only 3 years ago, and then from there I think it went to Broadway. So, in this 10-minute conversation, we addressed the issue of why the version in Edinburgh had a male Bobby rather than a female Bobby. There's no wrong answer, of course, but it's interesting to hear why. And then, of course, quite naturally, we talk about the character of Bobby. So, let's hear 10 minutes of the excellent conversation I had with Claire Nolan, Fee Simpson, who were the co-directors, Lara Sell, the producer, and Connor O'Quinn, the actor who played Bobby in this version of Company from the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. Musical talk.
I was just going to say about the London production. I had obviously fallen in love with that production, and talking about gender switching, they also switched the gender of Amy to
Andy,
Jamie.
Oh, Jamie.
So
well, it's a better rhyme, isn't it?
Jamie and Paul.
Yeah.
Andy was April. So the girlfriends became boyfriends. But
your memory's terrible.
Yeah, it was. Well, yeah, I just love this production. But they made Jamie and Paul, so it was a gay couple. And if you were going to gender switch it, I would have wanted to be Jamie. But then my reservations about playing Bobby were people seeing Company after seeing the gender switch, which worked so well, and people saying, "Oh, we'd never have a male Bobby again." Yeah. I was like, "Yeah, I kind of agree." 'Cause I've seen the female one, and talking about that scene with April. In my imagination, seeing a man play that role, it would have been very creepy and a bit like he's taking advantage of her. So I think. I hope the way that we're doing it is quite delicate, and nuanced to really try and make Bobby quite a nice, but
he's probably nicer now,
with flaws.
Oh yes,
but a flawed but nice guy.
I think that's the context, though. There's much better. I mean, it's still a long road to go in everything, but the 21st century is. Ignore what the Daily Mail says. The 21st century is better than the 20th century. And in 1970, when Company first came out, Bobby probably wasn't a very nice man and probably was sexually exploiting a number of women. The amount of affection or not is not always clear and can be done, once again, in different ways. So, but I agree with you. Trying to make Bobby sympathetic or understandable is a really essential part of what it is. And actually, you want Company to, that was written in 1970. I had no expectation that what we were seeing, what I saw yesterday, was anything other than now, contemporary. Maybe not many mobile phones, but that's the only thing that feels really different. You can tell me you actually did set it in 1970, but to me it felt, it's universal enough to have been yesterday, as it actually was for me. So let's talk about Bobby, and I'm actually going to start with you, Connor, but I will want to hear everybody's view. How do you see Bobby? What are his motivations, his or hers, but in this case yours? Your Bobby.
So
no wrong or right answers. Remember that.
It's the thing. An enigma, to be honest, at the centre of it all, because all the other characters, I think, are so clear cut, and
they found themselves.
Yeah, I wouldn't say stereotypes, but they're all, very
archetypes.
Archetypes,
yes.
Exactly. All very clear cut, written in a specific way, all together, and they've all got their scenes, and Bobby just floats through them all.
Floats is an interesting word.
Yeah. Well, I my view on the piece is that it all happens in Bobby's head, and
when he's blowing out his candle at the beginning, by any chance?
Yeah, at the end. Yeah.
Oh, well, there's a lot of blowing out of candles.
Yeah.
But yes.
So the reason, in my interpretation of it, is that because he can't blow it out, it's because it's not real. It's just him not actually wishing something. So from the beginning to the end, I think the whole thing is in his head and visions, and then he decides to not turn up to the birthday party at the end. And as Fee was saying, I think the more times I do it, the more epiphanies and little visions of who Bobby is come to me. But I think the biggest thing Bobby realises is that he's putting so much effort into supporting all the couples around him and being the third person,
Charles be the three of us.
Yeah, just looking after everyone else. All that energy he's putting into supporting them, he can put into someone else, and be one of the couples himself.
Can I ask, therefore, and I might ask this to everyone, is it your conclusion that at the end of your version of Company, Bobby has found himself and wants to sincerely get married in his own right, not because other people are pressing him? Is that the path? I know it might be a different question if I ask you tomorrow, yeah.
Sometimes it feels like he's resigned to the fact he's never get married. Sometimes I think he's like, well, I do think that he's like, right, he's understood how to give himself to someone else, and he's willing to do that and to be vulnerable with someone else. I think I'd like to think that Bobby goes off and finds someone and actually has a decent marriage and relationship with them.
I would like to think, though, that you're caging this so interestingly,
but it's just,
clearly.
Well, there's also another element to it, talking about the gay thing. Like, I think it would be wrong of me to dismiss that. I do think, I'm not saying Bobby's gay, but I think there's, in the text, there's everyone's saying, have I got a girl for you? Bobby ought to have a woman. Like, all the couples are saying he needs to have a woman. And the only song when Bobby really talks about women is someone is waiting, just like all the women in my life. But it doesn't mean it has to be a woman.
Could be the same emotional connection, of course.
Exactly. And at the end he says somebody. It's less about sexuality. It goes beyond sexuality and gender. It's more just having someone to look after and to share his life with.
Well, you preempted one of my questions, because I think it is a valid interpretation that is Bobby gay. It's a valid question. And I have yet to make my mind up. I've got a slightly different conclusion on Bobby to you, I think. But actually, I'd like to hear what other people think as well, and then we'll carry on. Thank you, by the way. That was genuine, and I want to probe more, by the way.
I mean, I think mine is pretty much the same. I think in terms of, like, in the end, does he get married, does he not? I think it's just kind of, you see, like, his thought process, you see all his interactions, and when you leave him at the end of the show, I think as an audience, you just kind of got to leave him and hope. I think it's quite a nice thing that you're just kind of there, like, well, he's learned all of this, he's made all these discoveries. Will he, won't he? But at least you were there on that journey with him.
So it's the route, the journey is, but it's still quite difficult to see because I don't know what the outcome is. So, and if you don't know where he is at the end, that's quite a difficult journey to sort of describe for you as directors and you as an actor, but also for us as an audience. So I accept, I mean, you're right, it is a journey of discovery, but what the discoveries take him to, I think is still oblique. But can I ask?
I think
it's like blind date, same question. So number one, please.
I view Bobby, I think there's so much going on throughout the entirety of the show that I think he's almost kind of going through the sensory overload where he doesn't know what he wants. There's so much going on. He's in the middle of New York. There's just a constant flurry of activity, be that in his relationships or where he's going or what he's doing. And at the end, I think being alive is him coming to peace with himself and his relationship with himself, be that he may be gay or he may be wanting a loving relationship. I just find being alive, like you say, the hopeful kind of end to the storyline, to the through line, that I see it as he's finding himself and he becomes more at peace with himself. That's how I view it.
Peace. You see, once again, being at peace. I think I like that interpretation because I like the idea of him finding peace through his discovery. But once again, it's what does that peace mean? Well, let's do it. Same question to number 3, please.
I think, to be honest, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think for someone who didn't know the show as well, I think the clear parts of, like, I'd say sort of shifts in Bobby's attitude come in sort of the 3 sort of solos, I suppose. But that's quite a sort of superficial way of looking at it, but I feel like that's sort of what I would relate to. I also think there's the really beautiful bit in in Someone Is Waiting when he's sort of saying, have I missed them and did I let them go? But then it was saying that maybe another person has also done that. And I think, like, I always think a bit of, like, for context, I feel like being 35 and unmarried probably, back then would be more shocking, and I think now you could probably think that there'd be something different, being like, it's not actually the end of the world. And I think there's something to think that, like, maybe if it was more sort of modern sort of perspective on it, you'd think, yeah, well, there's still loads of time, you can meet different people in relationships, and I think for Bobby now, I would think it would probably be more of a, about himself sort of opening up for some potential rather than, like, it being a disaster situation.
But it must feel odd, I suppose, if you are the only single one amongst your circle of friends who are all in couples. I can relate to that. I'm a single man. I have been all my life because I like it. Bob, this is one of the reasons I think Bobby's quite an interesting character. I can see I can project. I mean, Bobby is also a character onto which one projects yourself or your thoughts, and that's quite difficult, I think, for an actor, because actually he's not a cipher at all. He's a character in his own right, but there is his friends project on him. I like the fact that in the relationship you see with the friends, he has different roles with them all, and that actually suggests a sort of chameleon character, and a chameleon character is a hiding character. So, for example, there's that early scene, isn't it, where he's constantly being told off for asking questions. But in the next scene, where he's with a different couple, they are asking him questions for the most part. And then there's another scene where actually the couple are merrily chatting away to themselves, having a fight, and Bobby is essentially watching. And in other scenes, forgive me, I'm doing it again. Bobby is a referee kind of character. You know, he has different functions in each of the different relationships, or so it seems to me. And a multifaceted character would have that, but also a character that's hiding in plain view would do that, it seems to me.
Musical talk. Well, there we are. The gender switch and the character of Bobby in 10 minutes. And of course you cannot do justice to those questions in 10 minutes. So I hope you'll be delighted to hear that you'll be able to hear the full version of that conversation, which extends to about an hour, in a future episode of Musical Talk. And it was a privilege to talk to Claire, Fee, Lara and Connor. And I thought it was a 4-star show and a brilliant interpretation of a true classic. But Company wasn't the only classic piece of Broadway theatre to have made its way to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2022. And to narrow it down even further, it wasn't even the only classic piece of Broadway to make its way to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe that began with a C, because we also had Kander and Ebb's Curtains. And what an excellent production that was as well. So let's hear another 10-minute excerpt from a longer conversation that I held with Patrick Holl, Katie Slater, who together were the co-directors of the show, and Falk Meyer, the musical director, as we hear another 10-minute extract from a much longer conversation where we talk about the score and also the show-stopping pieces in the wonderful Kander and Ebb Curtains. Musical talk. But let's talk the score a little bit, if I may.
Yeah, for sure. So I'd heard Show People before, and like that was one that I was quite familiar with going in. But then listening through the rest of the show, I ended up loving it. Like Tough Act to Follow is one of my favorite musical theatre songs ever now. Just the whole coming on, and it's just this massive jazz moment, and then it fades away. I basically, the original orchestration is for 15, and we couldn't fit 15, and we had to cut it down to a band of 8. This was my first ever But
everyone's got two hands, can't they multitask?
I did a show choir this year where I had to do a little bit of orchestrating and a little bit of writing out parts, but that was mostly compiling parts. This one I had to properly reorchestrate for. I got a second keyboard player, so we're playing the missing orchestra parts as well as the piano parts, and then all the instruments, like I have saxes going, for example, in that way, da 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 dum da da da, so they're going between these bass lines and these soprano lines, and it took a long time. It took a really long time, and it's been something I've been working on over the last 2 months, but I've really, really enjoyed it, and I'm really, really happy with it. It's such a Kander and Ebb, they kind of wrote this musical, and I feel like the scores just kind of wrote themselves, kind of like they're just so good. They just put some stuff on a page, and it was just amazing. And it's
I bet they did work quite hard on it, though.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, because the simpler it is, the harder it is. Isn't it? I mean,
they just naturally just wrote such a intricate, beautiful score, and I've so enjoyed playing it, even though the piano parts are very difficult.
Although you orchestrated some of them, of course. So. Here's a question though: what's hidden in that score? Because there are a few jokes which the audience can or can't get, depending on how much, there's a brief moment of Chicago, one of their other shows, and that suggests a certain kind of feel, but there are other gags in there are other musical interlacings as well, aren't there? And as I say, these leitmotifs, I mean, how important is it for you as an orchestrator then to sort of really emphasise those things, or do you actually let them sit on the bed and let people spot them? Where does the emphasis come?
I think mainly what I tried to follow with this was kind of just making as good a replica as what I heard on different productions of it, like watching people do it, especially professional productions, and also kind of the original audios, what kind of melody lines need to be conserved, and kind of delegating them out to, like, you know, we couldn't fit a trombonist, so giving those trombone parts to a saxophonist.
And the slide handle.
Yeah, but then there's a really nice moment with I Miss the Music, which is, you know, the more you think about it, the lost writing partner, it's really emotional, and it's really, really sweet. Yeah, it's just lovely.
But there's some also, I mean, forgive me, there's the early song where Christopher Belling, the director, is actually auditioning the lyricist, essentially, to be the lead when that vacancy arises. That song always reminds me of Sondheim. It sounds much more Sondheimian to me than Kander and Ebb. There's a couple of orchestrations. I don't have the terminology, I don't have the lexicon for music. I'm afraid I'm a words man rather than a music man, but I like my music, so I'll try and describe it as best I can. But there's something about the orchestrations and the tonality that seems to me to be Sondheimian. I mean, you can say, no, that's nonsense. You're a silly old idiot. I do get it.
I get what you mean with kind of the way it uses the chromatic notes. And in the original, it's an oboe, but we don't have an oboe. But suddenly this oboe comes in with this one note. And I do very much see what you mean. Yeah. It's like it's chromatic in that way. It kind of stands out a little bit in this musical, which has a lot of really brassy numbers. But I mean, this musical has such a variety of things. In the Same Boat is just its own world. Kansas Land, just suddenly you have this completely Wild West number. It's brilliant.
We'll come back to the music, but I'd like to come back to the narrative and the direction, if I may then. Forgive me, let's talk about the big showstopper numbers. Now, for the most part, they are actually in the show that's being put on, rather than the environment of curtains. So they're in Kansas Land. You know, That Away is the one that really sort of immediately comes to mind. It's a sort of, I mean, at one level, it could be a terribly tiresome song because it's got a lyrical joke in it, which is essentially that almost every line rhymes with, or nearly rhymes with, the word that away. And therefore there are a couple of, I'm not going to say false rhymes, because it's playful and therefore is allowed to play around the sounds. So they're not absolute homonyms, I suppose, or rhymes anyway, but they are, but in the region of, you know, Attaboy and That Away don't quite work, but actually by then you're bought in, you know, the audience say, right, I'm with this. But also, it could be constraining lyrically. But it's not really about the lyrics, is it? Actually, it's really about the fact it's a music and dance number. So, you know, once again, you've got different pulls. You know, how important is it to get the lyrics right, or do you actually say, right, we're just going to let them float, and here we go? And this is a question to the three of you, because actually, as a show-stopping number, it's got to be the directors, it's got to be your choreographer, who isn't here today, and your musical director working, I hope. I was going to say in tandem, but there's four of you, and that's two tandems.
Yeah, I mean, I think for some of the songs we definitely focused a lot on the lyrics, like He Did It, and the same
the diction.
But I think actually for That Away we did just kind of let the lyrics float and more focused on creating the salute number and the atmosphere of that for that number anyway.
It's a weird, I think that's always a weird one. I think it doesn't really add anything to the plot line in any way, really. And it comes at a point where they're making sort of advances in the murder mystery, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere this random number comes in.
Rehearsals!
Yeah, exactly. And just, I don't know, it's a weird one, I think. And also the big joke is sort of that they're supposed to be making fun of these sort of golden age musicals, aren't they?
Yes.
So I think that the forced rhymes like Paraguay and Mendeley sort of works quite well, because it's sort of making fun of these old musicals that were sort of all about nothing, a bit camp and just about nothing, really.
Well, where the songs weren't integrated.
Yeah,
because you're right, it's not an integrated song in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously it's made to work, because it shows you the development of, you know, the pressure in the background, but actually that's contextual, that's not plot so much. But it is also relief, isn't it? Which is often what these things were in the 30s and 40s and 50s musicals. But actually, you've had a bit of plot. We don't want to worry you, but you know, let's have a lovely number.
No, that's not a song. Yeah.
So it does do that, but it's terribly high energy. It's a full ensemble. It's the male and female cast. Female cast principally. There are costume elements. You know, there are detachable skirts a la Bucks Fizz. You're far too young to remember Bucks Fizz. But
I've never seen them. I cannot see.
You're in a different room.
I cannot see the dance for That Away. I haven't seen the dance for Tough Act to Follow. I've never seen the Kansas Land dance. They were doing the fight call yesterday, and I was just like, "You do that?" I didn't even realize. But about That Away specifically. It's a massive ensemble number, and when they go, "Don't blow your kiss away," oh, da 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 da, like when they have these kind of intersecting lines. the words aren't really nearly as important as the kind of the emphasis on like the lines going between the upper voices and then the lower voices, and it's all mingling,
the
and then the
soundscape,
harmonies, and yeah, exactly.
More than the individual elements of it, I suppose.
It's really, really nice. Yeah.
It's also got what I would call a deceptively easy sound. Once again, it's got at the beginning at least. It's boom diddle 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 boom boom boom, which sounds like a band marching. You know, it's quite an American sound, but also quite a simple sound. And of course, then the show's that piece, Showstopper, stops being simple in any way, whilst at the same time, sort of sounds like it is simple. Even you know, to me, it's a tremendous sort of build-up of and it's sort of. It's also one of the very few songs I think I've come across in musical theatre where there's any suggestion of male arousal, I should say, by the way. There's the, and of course in a British context that's more so, isn't it? Because there's a line where the female characters are dancing slinkily. I think that would be Bob Fosse style-esque. And that's the point of it. They are trying to sort of, be exciting for the men, and the men make a reference to what's this stirring in my pants. But of course, pants is a trouser in America, and something quite, just a little bit more intimate here. And therefore, for a British audience, I was talking to an American woman the other day in a queue, like you do in Edinburgh. Not about curtains, we were just talking about a totally different show. And we got around to the remarkably hot weather in Edinburgh this year, and she said to me in her very nice American accent, "Oh yeah, I've given up my woolen pants." And I had to explain to her but she had been much more intimate than I'd been expecting. And of course, she didn't mean that at all. She was just changing her trousers. Anyway, we will get back to the plot. So that away. Let's talk Bob Fosse then. And now our choreographer's not here, but obviously it's a big dance number. For the three of you, how much involvement do you have in the choreography as directors and musical directors? Because it's all collaborative. Yeah. And it's not Bob Fosse per se, but there is something about angular movement before they start running across the stage that naturally makes one think of Bob Fosse, and Bob Fosse is a very particular kind of choreography. And almost sets itself up, I always think, but that's a debate for another day perhaps.
I mean, we attended the choreography rehearsals, but Rose just has choreographed all those really big numbers.
And her name?
Rose Roberts.
There we are.
And she does all kinds of dance, but she does a lot of ballet. And I think you can see that in some of the numbers, but also she's choreographed things in this that she's never done before. So she has never choreographed ballroom, and then she choreographed Tough Act to Follow. So she's been fab. But yeah, I can definitely see Fosse in it as well. But yeah, she did those big numbers, and then we kind of had some input on the choreography in the numbers that are more kind of crafted movement, like Women's Dead, and he did it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
What kind of man, that kind of thing. That was
crafted movement is a really
yes.
But I think that's a lovely phrase. I really think that says something. Musical talk. And that's Curtains, one of my favourite shows, and the production in Edinburgh was excellent. It was deftly excellent, in fact, and I would give it 4 stars. Now, the next show that we're going to be discussing is something with an even longer history. It in fact originated in 1733 and was written by a man called Pergolesi. And if that name rings a bell with you, well it might, because he wrote a show called La Serva Padrona, or The Maid Turned Mistress, which is a short 40-minute comic opera written to fill a gap between a longer opera at that time in the early part of the 18th century. And it's never been out of production since then. And if the name of that show seems familiar to you, well it might, because in episode 689 we revisited one of the hits of the 2015 Edinburgh Festival Fringe, where a modern version of La Serva Padrona was brought to Edinburgh, but was renamed and recontextualised as the Secretary turned CEO. Well, La Serva Padrona was back in Edinburgh for 2022, and this time it was in the excellent and very capable hands of David William Hughes, an old friend of this programme, whose name you will also remember, I hope, from his previous shows, Wit and Mirth, and Elizabethan. You can certainly see he's a man who's travelling through the centuries to find inspiration for his Edinburgh Fringe offerings, and they're always excellent, and this show was no different. It was La Serva Padrona, performed by one person, that's David himself, with a clever framing device. So let's hear a 10-minute extract of the conversation I had with David Hughes about
how this opera has survived so long and has always been readapted to reflect the times in which it was produced, and of course find out more about David's own take on this perennial, fantastic piece of musical theatre history which refuses to lie down. Musical talk.
So, hi, I'm David. I'm doing a show called La Serva Padrona, which is originally an opera by Pergolesi from the 18th century, which I adapted, rearranged, and perform here at the Fringe.
Now, David, you're one of those people who I know always serve up a really accessible, really interesting, really funny show. And this year you have done it again. So it's a hat trick now, as far as I can see here at the Edinburgh Fringe. And yet every show is very different. And yet at the same time, thematically, there's a great connection, which is that your love of what I'm going to call historic music, for want of a better phrase, really shines forth. But you do that marvellous thing of transmuting it into very palatable, modern, accessible performances. And this year is a triumph.
Oh, thank you.
Not that the last show worked, but I think this year is particularly good because of the content and the overlay of the content and your performance. There's a kind of three things together creating this magnificent fusion. So perhaps explain the conceit of the show.
So the conceit of the show is I play the assistant manager of an opera house which has run out of money because of coronavirus and cost of living crisis and war in Ukraine.
How unlike real life.
I know. And then everyone else except me has been fired. And when I'm doing some work and cleaning out the basement of the opera house, I find the emergency opera kit, a leftover from the 1970s, and I decide to use this battered old kit with a cassette recorder and everything to put on a show and save the opera house and get everyone their jobs back. And also fulfill my character's personal dream, which is to one day perform an opera. So
it's a beautiful conceit, and it allows you to do that splendid thing of jumping in and out of the narrative of the opera.
Yeah.
But so let's talk immediately about the emergency opera kit. It's such a clever conceit. I really like the idea, and I love the fact that you point out that it's actually a response to the Cold War of the 1970s and 80s, and therefore the tech and it's a box with emergency opera kit written on the side of it, and within it is a cassette player. And the very fact that you hold up a cassette at the beginning of the show immediately makes us think, well, what, cassettes? No one's seen cassettes for a very long time. And then and on the cassette is the backing track that you're going to be singing to in the opera, which are beautifully arranged, and I do think beautifully. I'm not being ironic here, but beautifully arranged into my ear, sort of funky 70s sounds.
Yeah.
And you can imagine you could have bought the LP version of the instrumental version of Pergolesi's La Serva Padrona
Maybe it will be coming out soon.
by Jeff Love and his orchestra, or someone of that nature. So how did this come to be, I suppose, is the question.
So the starting point, I think, was either 2018 or 19, being at the Fringe with a friend of mine who's a conductor, and we were going around having a great time seeing a bunch of shows, and we were just saying, well, there's not much opera on the Fringe.
No.
And then we were thinking, well, why is that? And it's basically because opera is big and expensive, and if you're doing a show at the Fringe, it needs to be small and cheap. So that was the challenge. How can we find a way to do small, cheap opera? And it was this friend who put me onto this particular Pergolesi opera, because he'd done it before, kind of in a more conventional setting with orchestra and so on. And the original opera is only about 43 minutes long in performance. That seemed like a good one.
Yes, nice fit for an Edinburgh.
Yeah, so I cut down the music a bit to allow me to fit in this kind of meta script. And then I had the idea of the meta script quite early, because I like in opera you've got two levels, the arias and the recitatives, and then if you have a spoken play as well, you've got a third level, which is just nice.
Yeah, you're right, actually. It's all layered, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
And then I kind of started working on the show, and the first step was just I'm working with an English translation, but it's quite old-fashioned, so to sort of update that and cut down the music. And then I was just messing around with some music, and I thought, oh, this kind of works quite well as a funky one. How does this go? Then I ended up making the funky backing tracks, and then I thought, let's put it on a tape because that would be fun. And then coronavirus hit.
Yes.
And then I sort of stopped working on it, but also work expanded to fill the time available. So then that's when it came in with kind of doing all these extra things, like with all the masks and props and costumes and it was in a way quite good to have 3 years to develop a show instead of one. And I think it's like probably a bit more complicated than the previous shows I've done.
Sophisticated, I think the word is, although with this delightful veneer of being very simple. You know, I think there's a lot more going on than meets the eye. There are several layers of comedy, and it is actually really nice to be able, as a lay person, by which I mean someone who doesn't often go to opera, in fact by which almost never, to engage with, very easy to engage with opera, and to understand it, and to enjoy it in the way it's meant to be enjoyed, with the extra overlay of the, as you say, the meta story. There's a nice bit of shorthand there. I enjoyed that. Thank you. Let us talk about the Pergolesi first, then, if I may. Now, it's interesting. I saw a version of Pergolesi's La Serva Padrona retitled The Secretary Turned CEO.
I'm aware of that one,
Yeah, about 10 years ago, up here at the Fringe, and I know it had also toured, and I think it's available on one of the video streaming services somewhere. I really liked it, and I hadn't come across the piece before. I enjoyed that version. I'd always wondered what the original was like, and this, I feel I'm a step towards that with your show today. And funnily enough, I recognised some of the melodic lines in your version from the Secretary Turned CEO from a few years ago. So it's clearly a piece. Now, what I remember about it, and you'll be able to correct me much more here because this is much more your area of expertise in terms of your historic interest in music. But Pergolesi is I think he's pre-Mozart, isn't he? And if he'd lived longer, might have been better known. But I understand this is sort of his big show now. Listen to me, we don't mean. But it's the one that survived. And it's almost got a claim to be the father of modern musical theatre because it's the first sort of bite-sized musical comedy or opera comedy or operetta. And then Mozart comes along and gives us the Marriage of Figaro, Barbara Seville, and then he's not the Barbara Seville, is he? The Marriage of Figaro, and then Offenbach strolls along. I know there are big gaps. So I'm boiling this right down, but Offenbach directly create Gilbert and Sullivan because they're invited to gap fill one of his shorter shows, and that gives us Trial by Jury, and of course the response to that is then musical comedy a bit later on, and then that takes us into the American model of Cohan and onwards. There we are. I think like I have a few things to say about. So Pergolesi definitely is sort of like a proto-Mozart, if you will. He died young. Prozart.
He's got, and Mozart knew the La Serva Padrona. We know that, so there is an influence there.
How interesting.
And it's also an interesting opera because it's the oldest opera that has a continuous performance history. So there are plenty of older operas, but this is an opera that since it was written, it's been regularly performed in many different ways. And the cool thing about it, I think, is it's quite a simple story, and it has this mime character, and that gives you, as a producer or a adapter, a lot of flexibility. So the Secretary Turned CEO has this kind of corporate glass ceilings type message. And if you go from the start, so when it was first produced, it was performed for the nobles of Naples, and the joke is that Uberto is a nouveau riche guy who can't control his servants.
Yes.
Then it gets done, interestingly, in revolutionary France, in French, and then it's a revolutionary message of the servants are overpowering the master.
How clever.
Then there's a sort of 60s version, which is kind of a bit horrible to read nowadays, but it's called The Perfect Wife. And it's how a husband should teach the girl to be a perfect wife. And so that's a message from the 60s.
So that's the pro-patriarchy version.
Yeah, and then, but the cool thing is this is all the same opera, and it can say, I think the reason it survived is because it is able to say something to each era.
Which says there's truth in it somewhere, which is interesting. Even though it's sort of nonsensical, there's obviously something in there, or at least a truism on which we can project.
There's just this... It's just this wonderful tension of the guy who thinks he should be in charge ultimately isn't. And I guess that's at the root of so many comedies and stories. Yeah, he goes on some kind of a journey.
What that journey quite is yes, quite. But it's and then your performance of it is magnificent. So as you say, there are three characters, one of whom is essentially a non-speaking character, although has a function, but it's a clowning function more than anything else, isn't it? And then once again you can project on it. So you have a cut-out face for that, one of these masks, which you splendidly place on a music stand and then later on give a hat, and that's actually all it needs. It's wonderful. Yeah, but you have these two wonderful cut-out masks which you stick your face through on sticks. So and that gives you sort of the wealthier gentleman's periwig. And the full red locks of the servant, but the thing is, in your performance, you're playing both these characters, and you sing. And I'm telling you this from I went to see it with a composer friend of mine who was magnificently impressed by your singing performance in both the roles. He said not only were you doing the falsetto impressively, which I know you can do from your Elizabethan musical skills, but also you weren't just able to do the voice, you were able to do the voice and sing it accurately. Now, I would expect no less of you because you are an absolute expert in these areas, but it is an impressive feat. One should, just because you can do it doesn't mean we shouldn't all be surprised and amazed and delighted by it. It's a good performance. It's a magnificent performance.
Well, thank you.
And made all the more exciting by the fact you're sticking your head for a mask with a hole in it.
The two voices are really fun, and I've tried not only to have a high pitch and a low pitch, but also to give those voices some character, and that also comes from how you hold your face, because that affects the sound. And then jumping between the masks is fun, and that kind of comes from an old improv game which I used to play, which is called Multitask, I think we used to call it. Basically an improv game where one person plays one character as a scene and one person plays all the others, and you've probably seen it on Whose Line Is It Anyway. It's kind of a tried and tested concept. So I'm doing that with the masks. In rehearsal, I have had some injuries.
Oh no!
I've had to figure out how actually to stick my face quickly from one mask to another without hitting myself in the head.
Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. And there, just a short extract from the longer conversation that I had with David William Hughes about his one-man version of La Serva Padrona, which wowed me in Edinburgh. It also wowed Mike Shapiro and was just a fabulous show. David's shows are brilliant and it's always great seeing them, and this year was no different. And in fact, together his three shows make a fabulous hat-trick of productions spanning 3 centuries of song and musical theatre. It's fabulous. But for this show, La Serva Padrona, I gave David 5 stars. Because it was a sensational, striking tour de force. And I hope it's not too long until we get an opportunity to welcome David back to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in the future. Well, if that was a piece of 18th century writing, let's pop back even earlier to a piece originally by William Shakespeare. You might have heard of him. He was very well represented at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, and indeed, just one of his shows, Macbeth, had spawned at least 3 different musicals. And it's one of these we're going to be hearing a little bit of a conversation about next, because a fabulous new adaptation of Macbeth, set contemporaneously, was available to see in Edinburgh this year, and it was called Vote Macbeth. It was immediately brilliant, and another 5-star show. And I was privileged to have the opportunity to catch up with the man behind it, John Paul Liddell, to talk about this brilliant new adaptation of Macbeth, coming from a brilliant new theatrical company based in Glasgow, from a man who is himself a brilliant musical theatre talent. Let's hear from John Paul Liddell for just 10 minutes from this conversational extract about Vote Macbeth. Musical Talk.
My name is John Paul Liddell. I am the composer, writer, director and titular character in Vote Macbeth.
Now, Vote Macbeth is a new musical from a new company.
Yes.
It's an excellent new musical from an excellent new company. That's the word I missed out there.
Thank you very much.
But it really is. It was a phenomenal show. I saw it last night. It's powerful, it's muscular, it coheres, which is always important. And whilst it's very serious and intense, it's also got plenty of sort of light-hearted moments to lubricate it. I don't mean the send-up in any sense, but in good character form, there's and lovely thought-through elements. So there's a lot to unpack, I think, in this show. But it's an excellent show, and I want to start from that position. But you are a new company. So I think it would actually be an interesting narrative if we started with how the company came to be, because I think it only really sort of formed in 2022, is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And then when how did you come to the conclusion that not only do we want to start a new theatrical company, we want to come in with something that's incredibly impressive? Well, I can understand why, but it's not easy to do at Edinburgh, which is always an interesting way of starting anything, because it's a lovely place, but goodness me, 3 minutes in, 3 minutes out, and stairs and lifts and well, not lifts, stairs and slopes everywhere. So you're lugging furniture here, there, and everywhere. I've done a lot of talking. Tell me about the company.
So the company is Clyde Built Theatre Company. We are formed of people based in Glasgow who have a wide range of experience, kind of both professional and in community theatre, in a range of other companies across Glasgow. And we decided a couple of years ago that we wanted to start our own company. We were originally planning to put on our first production in 2020, but a pandemic intervened.
Yes, when you said a couple of years ago, I thought, I wonder what could possibly have stopped it happening.
Yeah. And one of the things that many of the people in the company kind of had as a common goal is we've all been to see many Fringe shows and as audience members, but had never been here as participants. So
you've never performed here before?
No.
This makes it all the more exciting for me and surprising, because, as I say, it was a good quality production.
Thank you.
At every level. So, great, splendid. So really sort of inspired to do it by shows that you'd seen in Edinburgh but elsewhere, but the Edinburgh show was the dream for the first item.
Yeah.
Now, there's a world of difference between saying we're going to put a show on in Edinburgh and doing it. And indeed, particularly the creative side of it, which is very much where you come in, I think.
Yes.
So you were responsible, or one of the movers and shakers of the company first?
Yes, that's right.
Lovely.
I had previously spent a long time doing every role possible in a number of other community theatre companies. So over the course of the past kind of 10-15 years, been everything from Cowboy No. 3 in Oklahoma to stage manager of Schools Edition Les Miserables to director and musical director and Mr. Mushnick in Little Shop of Horrors.
Goodness. All three of those in the same
in
one?
The same production, yes.
You're a man who likes, well, you must have capacity, but you're a man who likes responsibility, I think. Yes, quite.
Yes.
Splendid. So, you do sound like the right person for the job, finally. So, but as I say, you've got this idea, the group's been created, you want to take something to Edinburgh. How did you alight on Macbeth? And then it's not just Macbeth, it's a straight telling of Macbeth. It's not a send-up, but it's an adaptation with some interesting stuff in there.
Yeah.
And it comes to a very interesting, you've got a great hook at the end, which we'll discuss. But so it's not even let's just take this well-known text and do it. It's adaptation, adaptation, and then musicalisation. Once again, it seems such a big thing to ask. So, how did that decision get made?
A long time ago, so probably 15, 20 years ago,
right.
Watching a production of Macbeth, I thought about what would happen if this was set in the modern day, and the most obvious thing that jumped out to me was the witches being journalists.
Beautiful.
And so then just had that idea percolating at the back of my head for many years, and I suppose over the 2 years before the pandemic happened, kind of started to pull that together and write it. I've done a lot of choral arrangements and musical direction in the past, and little bits of composing, but this was the kind of first big
full
project
show,
that I took on as a sort of full end-to-end writing project. And I suppose starting from the idea of the newsreaders, or the witches as newsreaders, and then building out from there. So the first song that I sort of battered out on the piano was Hecate's song, fitting her into the story of the newsreaders, and then built the other characters out from there. We initially had a version of the show that is about 90 minutes long, and our slot here was 60 minutes. So
you've got the usual Edinburgh slot,
yes.
Which is so presumably 55 minutes max on stage, isn't it? And then a hell of a lot of get out.
Yes, we cheated that slightly. I think we've got 1 hour, 1 minute and 40 seconds worth of music, so our get out is only 3.5 minutes.
You play the piano as you leave the room.
Yes.
But yes, and that's a big ask. So, but you envisage it as a 90-minute show in the first place, because also that's sort of, it's also a very difficult show to condense. There's a lot going on in Macbeth. Obviously, in the version I saw, which was we'll call it the hour version, there are some characters who aren't there that you might expect. Prince Malcolm is the most sort of important of the characters, who doesn't seem to turn up in this, but is he in the 90-minute version, or is he an elision that you had to make?
He's been in various versions, so I suppose the two characters who have been in previous versions who didn't make it to this version were Lady Macduff and Malcolm, and we had quite a long section with Malcolm and Fleonce kind of pairing up to challenge Macbeth together, and as we worked through that and looked at reducing the time, Fleonce was a much more interesting character than Malcolm.
And essential as well.
Yes.
In this version, certainly.
Indeed.
No, because it is so difficult, isn't it? But I always think it's great that people actually are not put off by the Edinburgh thing, but they write the show that needs to be written, and then you adapt it again.
Yes.
It's a form of adaptation.
Yep.
If you're not writing it direct for that. So these ideas were percolating, as you say, 15, 20 years or so.
On and off.
Yeah. Yes. Not solidly. I'm sure. Well, it sounds like you've been doing plenty in your spare time. So, no, I'm really interested in that because actually, that was the moment I knew I was going to enjoy the show. As I sat there with the audience, there is a kind of news anchor table, and it says 3W News, I think it is.
Yes.
And of course, you think 3W. Oh. The three witches, or the three weird sisters, depending on which W you fancy. And then, of course, they come on and they are, in the American style, news anchors, quite enthusiastic news anchors in the American style. But, of course, then suddenly in the lyrics, and I want to talk about the songs later, but in the lyrics they make a point about you heard it here first. It is actually that concept of, by hearing it here first, that's a prediction.
Yep.
Actually they're sort of on the edge of the news and perhaps speculating, which of course is also now part of the modern news world when it once wasn't. That the idea that actually their news is their predictive power.
Yep.
You just think, that's a beautiful fit, and you just think, right, this has been thought through. So I thought that was a lovely start. And then it doesn't lose anything after that either. I'm assuming that you did the heavy lifting on this during the 2 years of COVID in terms of creation.
Quite a lot.
So what's your method? I mean, this is interesting, isn't it, in the sense that actually you can do a lot, and as you say, you've worked your way through all these different on the stage, off the stage, and creative sides, which is brilliant and shows your talent. But also, how does fusion work for creation for you? It's different for everyone, but I can only assume that having all those talents and all those different options on your palette allow you to create more cohesively than people who are working in a collaborative team. I appreciate all theatre is a collaborative team, and that comes later in this. But do you create on your own, or do you also have people who sort of at least? How do you do it? I suppose. Sorry, that was a very long way of saying how do you do it.
A bit of both, I suppose. My initial plan was kind of breaking down the overall text of the original play into, there has to be a song here, there has to be a song here, this is a thing I definitely want to feature, and doing a sort of first version of this is the track list essentially, and then of those, some of them kind of immediately jumped out as things I already had an idea about. So I wrote number 9 and then number 13 and then went back to number 5 kind of thing, and some of the other people involved in the company heard the very earliest versions of those songs. So my partner, who was also the choreographer and the bankroll and Fleonce, and
very
made
clever.
all of the set and the costumes.
There's quite a lot of talent balancing around there, isn't there? Quite.
And designed the programmes, designed everything that was involved in the show, designed the poster.
Painted the 3W.
Yes. He's hugely talented, so there are a lot of back and forth with him, and also with the orchestrator, Lorna, who heard sort of the earliest versions of the songs and played back kind of feedback from a musical point of view as well.
We should say immediately, and we haven't said it, but it's sung through.
Yes.
There is no dialogue in the old-fashioned sense, or the understanding of that. That's also a big decision, because you're telling the whole story, the complicated story, in song. And I was, once again, I was terribly impressed by that. Sung through can sometimes be tiring for an audience. This wasn't tiring at all. This is something, I came with an American friend of mine who's a composer, and when we came out, he said to me, I said, that's amazing for an hour. And he said, was that only an hour? And then he didn't mean that in the, it seemed like a lot longer. What he was saying was so much had been packed into that hour. It's high intensity all the way through. It's almost no time for applause. We go out of one song into another song, which is obviously disappointing at one level for you on the stage. But actually, the other thing it does, of course, is it brings, oddly it makes it filmic. But in this, it has that kind of boom, boom, boom action. I mean, it is, in its way, a 21st century Hollywood action, political thriller. I mean, that is exactly what this is. It's genius of Shakespeare, but it can be that. But why did you make that decision?
Partly, I find it really hard to write dialogue.
No! But, you're an honest man.
But I think the structuring the songs, I guess, really around the structure of the play, and so working from the original play and thinking through, we need to hit this moment, we need to hit this moment, and so then having built the songs around that, it felt like we didn't need things in between.
Yeah, so it's beats,
Yeah.
as it were, it's plot beats,
Yes, that's
plot
right.
points. Musical talk. There we are, John Paul Liddell talking about his show, Vote Macbeth. It was a 5-star show, a brilliant, witty, muscular tour de force, and I'm delighted that you'll be able to hear the full conversation with John Paul about this magnificent show in a future episode of Musical Talk. But there's also a chance to see this show because it's hoped that there will be a production in Glasgow and indeed that it may come back to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe next year in 2023. So do look for it online. And you can find its website at Clyde Built Theatre Company. Clyde Built being one word there. And I can say honestly that Vote Macbeth was one of the 3 best musicals that I saw at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe this year. Now, I said at the beginning of this programme that all the musicals that we were going to be talking about were either classic shows in their own right or based on other classic texts. And that's exactly what we've had. Curtains and Company, La Serva Padrona and Macbeth, filling those 2 categories very nicely. The third one, well, I still think it's a classic, but it's a classic in a very different way because we're returning to Showstopper, the improvised musical. And I think it's earned the right to be called a classic these days because that company has now been around for very nearly 15 years and it's been magnificent. And it produces new improvised full musicals pretty much every night of the year, certainly every night of the year at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. It's one of those things that I always try and see if I get the chance because I'm never disappointed. And how often can you say that about a new musical? So we're going to finish off today's episode with a 10-minute extract of a conversation I had with Mike Shapiro. I've mentioned him already. He's an old friend and presenter of this programme and a composer in his own right. And he was seeing Showstopper for the very first time, whereas I, of course, was an old veteran. So let's hear 10 minutes of the conversation that we had about the magnificent Showstopper musical that we saw, and in particular with the focus on music and jazz, and whether improvising a song is akin to the world of jazz creation. Here's Mike Shapiro and me. Musical talk. Something you observed is that the music arrangements and support are completely different in Showstopper to other improvised musicals. You made the point in the past that you'd seen single people normally doing it, a person on a keyboard or something.
I think it's most practical when you, especially perhaps if you have an improv team that's maybe not a musical specialty group. Musically, I imagine, I'm not saying this based on any kind of experience or authority, this is just kind of, we'll call it educated conjecture. You want the style to be something that everyone can understand, and you want the song form to follow a familiar path. So while your brain is trying to figure out what you're going to rhyme with the words you just said spontaneously, you kind of know what your musical destination is. And I could tell that, well, for one thing, what struck me as unusual is that there were not only improvised solo lines, but the group were able to sing choruses in harmony together, as if they all knew in advance what was coming. And it's always a joy in improv context when there's a seeming ability to predict the future. So if everyone jumps in on seemingly by magic, they know when the chorus is happening, they know how to harmonize, they know when there's kind of a ritardando at the end and a big winding down of the final verse. And I think it's because they're just familiar with the musical theater conventions so well that they can follow the path they're on musically and know where it's going to end up. And I think that adds a level of coordination that I haven't seen in other improv musicals.
I suspect it's also to do with levels of passivity and activity. Now, improvisation always strikes me as being something where you really do need to be active. But you can't just sit on your hands and watch your fellow performers enjoy themselves. To be part of a troupe, you have to be in it. And I think you could detect that actually to slightly different levels of energy and activity in the performers that we saw last night. I don't mean that in any critical way on some of them. What I mean is there was one character in particular who I thought was always in with the physical. If there was a physical element, he seemed to be there very, very quickly. He wheeled a trolley on when the Phantom of the Opera song started, He sort of appears out of nowhere pushing what I would consider to be a stationary trolley in order to do the sort of the gondola look.
Right.
But someone's got to think to do that. The two actors, the man and the woman who were singing the Phantom Star duet, weren't in a position to do that themselves, so someone has to bring that on. Taking that to the music, as you were saying, I suppose when a song starts and when you know you're in an ensemble kind of piece, I suppose you either sing the melody line or you do try and improvise the harmonies around it, in order to make those noises. So I suppose if you are an active improviser, that's going to take you in that sort of direction. Or am I just pontificating madly? I think I might be pontificating madly, but it sounds reasonable.
Yeah, well, it's what we're both doing because we're not actors.
But you made a very interesting point. As we left, you were talking about the fact that the interesting thing about an improvised song is, of course, no one yet knows where it's going, what its destiny is and how it's going to conclude and things like that. Because I was suggesting that actually this point we're talking about is akin to jazz. And you made the very good point that the difference between it is that jazz starts from a set text, essentially, the music as written, a song, traditional jazz. Maybe the traditional jazz is not the right word. The broadest family of jazz is generally taking a piece of music and then improvising in various ways upon it. I'm sure there are people who will disagree with me with that, but that's a shorthand for it. But it can always then come back to its sort of mothership, as it were, and very often you get that. You get a sort of relatively straight performance of the first time round, and then each of the instruments will have a go, and there might be some duets, and then it comes back round to actually the melody that you remember at the beginning, which is the actual melody as written. With an improvised song, there is no mothership. You cannot know where you're going to go because it hasn't yet happened. So it's not quite the same thing as jazz, and yet at the same thing, it is that concept, isn't it? That being able to anticipate, I suppose. It's future jazz. It's sort of knowing where it's going and anticipating in anticipation of something that hasn't yet been set down and never will.
Well, songs in different styles have, to some degree, a predictable structure.
Yes.
The simplest example is, I think, if you're playing your standard 12-bar blues, you can anticipate every chord change. You know exactly where it's going, and that tends to be the easiest style for improv groups to riff on musically. As you get to other styles of music and musical theater, there's still some predictability. You can kind of sense when you're going back to the one chord, or when the chorus is going to end, or when the chorus is going to lead into an outro, but it's not quite as predictable as something like the blues. So it was very impressive how, for example, the chorus, the group would always seem to know when the chorus was happening, and they would all join in, and they would expertly recite the lyrics that had been improvised during the last chorus. So you get the impression that, of course it's a song, and they knew what the chorus was. But clearly they didn't. They were just very attentive, and they memorized the lyrics that one person just came up with on the fly, and they all came in and sang it together. And that level of coordination, I think, is what is distinct to this group in comparison to most of the other experiences like this that I've had.
So it's almost, in a strange way, I was going to say they're like an improvising choir. And the reason I'm making that suggestion, that it sounds mad the moment you say it, but actually by choir, I think, the choirs are quite often extremely structured, as you'd expect. But they do have interconnectivity in the way that they sing, solo songs, backing solo songs, singing as a choir, singing in different combinations. And I suppose this group is doing the same kind of thing, but in an improvised way, which is pure magic as far as I'm concerned. It really is prestidigitation in its truest form. Of course it isn't, it's a highly structured, crafted process, and you have to train yourself. I know that the one thing I do know about improvisation is that you have to be sort of on point. You have to keep yourself, the muscle memory has to be kept at a certain pitch. I know that people say if you stop doing it for even something like 2 days, you get rusty. So actually you have to do it daily, or at least only give yourself one day off every now and then. I'm really interested in the music part, and forgive me, it's a privilege for me to have a composer with me who has the handle on music in a way that I don't. I can describe it and enjoy it and sort of talk about it in layman's terms, but you are the expert. But interestingly, we had 3 instrumentalists.
4, I think.
Well, yes, I was going to say 3 as a main group. There was a keyboards player, there was a saxophonist, I think, and I think there was percussion.
It was more of a wind doubler because I think she picked up a clarinet sometimes. So she was versatilely, if that's a word, jumping between different wind instruments, as is typical in musical theater.
She blows, but she didn't suck.
I'm just going to smile through that one.
Thank you. But I assume by the 4th instrument, you're talking about the fact that Dylan, who's the producer character, the writer character, who sits on the other side of stage to the trio, essentially, the musical trio, also occasionally picks up his guitar and joins in on some of the numbers. And I think you also made the observation that it's quite interesting that he does that from afar. He's not in the heart of the music, he's not in the heart of the performance. He is actually literally sitting on a slightly raised pedestal. As all composers should be, of course.
Right, emotionally and otherwise. I couldn't tell if he was playing guitar or bass. I think guitar would make more sense. Well, here's the thing that impressed me about this. Let me jump back to the abstract level. With improvised music, you would expect there only to be one musician who is playing the harmonies or is deciding what harmonies are next, what chords. And the reason is that if you have two players both trying to improvise decision about what chord is next, if they're not in Vulcan mind meld with each other, you're going to get a clatter of chaos. So what you can get away with is one musician, probably a pianist or keyboardist, making those major decisions, no pun intended,
yes.
And then you have soloists from monophonic instruments, a bass or guitar, playing individual notes, or in this case a wind doubler, who can kind of noodle along once they hear what the harmonies are. And that's why was it Dylan? It was the
yes.
MC? If he was playing guitar and if he was doing anything other than single note little licks, it was super impressive because that would mean he could anticipate what the next chord would be and then would adjust his playing harmonically to match. And I think that's possible if you have a group that has a lot of solidarity and history as musicianship, much like an experienced jazz trio would do.
They can anticipate in a strange way.
Exactly.
Each other, yeah.
In combination with having done these types of songs over and over and kind of knowing what the big picture is. But regardless, it was very impressive. And for him to coordinate across stage without visible headphones, I didn't really see him.
No, I don't. I think he was listening acoustically as we were.
Yeah, so that's super impressive, is the short version of that ramble.
Musical talk. Well, the return of Edinburgh Festival Fringe atmospheric background noises, and I recorded these at this year's festival to give you just a flavour of the atmosphere of walking around the streets, let alone going to see the shows, tells us that we're at the end of this programme. We've listened to 5 extracts from 5 conversations, and in each case the full conversations from which they came will be broadcast over the next few weeks and months. And I hope that you'll find them an insightful record, a scrapbook almost, but with creative insight into this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe and its musical theatre offerings, which felt to me like an absolute return to form. 2022 will be remembered, I think, as one of the great Edinburgh Festival Fringes. The quality was there, the atmosphere was there, and at the end of the day, the Fringe was there and staying there. Happy 75th anniversary, Edinburgh Festival Fringe. And, of course, the last conversation you heard was with Mike Shapiro. And I'm pleased to say that he and I sat down to have a number of conversations to talk about some of the shows which we've discussed over the last 2 weeks, but also a number of shows which we haven't yet discussed here on Musical Talk about the Fringe. So, what you'll be getting in the next few weeks is a number of roundup conversations with me and Mike, interspersed with occasional episodes about other things, just to keep you interested in the wider world of musical theatre, which continues, of course. And those roundup episodes will act, if you like, as an overture to the run of interviews proper with the people behind the great musical theatre shows of the Edinburgh Festival Fringe 2022. I hope that sees your appetite well and truly whetted. And frankly, there is nothing more for me to say in this episode, so I'm going to stop saying anything. And you know how I'm going to do it. There's a secret word that unlocks my magical silence. Here it goes. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk produced and edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2022. To find out more about the world of musical talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos.